Almost every time socialism is discussed, some flaw, which in my experience is usually a misconception, if not outright projection, will be brought up that something makes socialism unworkable.
You mean like basic math?
One of the most common things that we hear is that supposedly there is no capacity for innovation under socialism.
Well, I'd like to hear you explain how it is, because every single time socialists illustrate what they want, including you, Hakeem, it's all about taking the means of production. None of it is about where the means of production actually come from to begin with. So instead of workers taking over a factory, you need to explain not only how they can build a new factory, but why they're not already doing it.
In order to clear up this misconception, we need to explain how many of the innovations we use today came about.
No, we don't. He's just resorting to the microcosm fallacy. If he can show one single nugget of socialism while an innovation is made, even if socialism had nothing to do with it, even if socialism worked against it, he'll claim credit for it. Whereas capitalism is never responsible, no matter how prominent its role. He actually says this. Yes, capitalism was there, but it happened in spite of it, not because of it. Socialists always do this. The second thing he does is claim that workers make everything. Again, the question is, why don't they already? Why do they seem to need this capitalist factory owner? How come you don't have a bunch of workers standing out in a field or something, then all of a sudden there's a factory and they start churning out stuff? Again, he didn't put any thought into how this comes about. He doesn't even seem to understand it's an issue. And the third thing is the ever-present profits canard, which I've debunked so much it's laughable, so I don't think I need to do it yet again. But here's the real issue. We see quite clearly and without any mistaking that innovation is directly correlated with economic freedom according to the Global Innovation Index. The more people are free to produce capital, the more the innovation. Not only does Hakeem not propose any mechanism for innovation under socialism, his claims go against direct observation.
Let me ask you this. How many Newtons, Ghazalis, and Einsteins has humanity lost in sweatshops, on cotton fields, or in cobalt mines?
Or in patent offices? Didn't think that one through, did ya?
How many due to systemic imperialism draining the third world of resources and keeping them poor?
Right, because that's the reason the third world doesn't advance. Not because they're all a bunch of socialist hellholes. Do you know he actually had the audacity to bring up United Fruit Company? As if it wasn't totally backed up by the Costa Rican government? For those who aren't familiar, here's the short version. A state conspired with another state to use a company as a guise to overthrow a third state's ruler, and when it didn't work out, they blamed the company. Oh, and they're also to blame for the Banana Massacre, even though it was committed by the Colombian army under the command of General Cortez Vargas. He also goes into expensive tuition fees, which I've already shown are the fault of government, functional illiteracy, which is the result of government schooling, and inequalities in education, which likewise is because of government schools, all of which I've talked about before. Whenever someone wants me to debunk a video, the question I ask is there anything that I haven't already debunked 100 times? Well, now you see why I ask that. Of course, when it isn't, it's something ridiculous like this.
U.S. pharmaceutical companies do virtually no research aimed at developing new drugs to cure diseases such as tuberculosis and malaria.
Are you kidding me? Who developed the antibiotics that cure tuberculosis? And pharmaceutical companies make all sorts of treatments and preventatives for malaria, including Malarone, chloroquine, doxycycline, melphaquine, primaquine, and tafenoquine. Come on, Hakeem, you can just look this stuff up. And yeah, if you were waiting for that one, take your drink.
That's not even commenting on parallel development by two firms of the same or similar technology, wasting twice as many resources.
And here's another stupid one. When only one manufacturer makes something, it's a monopoly. When more than one does, it's a waste of resources. Hey, Hakeem, why don't you tell us what third option you think your wonderful socialism offers? Two independently produced products are not going to be exactly the same. One might work in situations where the others won't. Just like all those malaria medicines I mentioned. They're all different and use different mechanisms towards fighting or preventing malaria. If you have a choice between A and B, and you're allergic to A, it's nice to have B. But Hakeem would call this a waste of resources and want to take that option away from you. Never forget that he said this, people.
Whatever innovation is done, it's used for profit rather than for human need.
And just how do you think you can measure human need? I guess I have to explain this yet again. Under capitalism, the only way you can profit is if you can get someone to voluntarily part with some of their money to buy your product. That means that, in their own subjective viewpoint, you're filling some of their needs, enough to be worth the money, and also enough to be worth more than anything else they could do with the money. If they think they're having their needs filled, Hakeem, who are you to argue? This is just one more piece of proof that socialists are authoritarians, because authoritarians replace your subjective opinion with theirs, believing that their subjective opinion is the one true objective fact.
As an example, Pfizer's patented drug fluconazole, which cures cryptococcal meningitis, a deadly side effect of AIDS, sells for $18 a pill, placing it beyond the reach of AIDS sufferers in southern Africa, for example. A generic version, produced in Thailand, however, outside the reach of Pfizer's patent, costs 60 cents a pill. The patent has expired since, and generics have become more frequent as a result.
See? He even says that the problem is patents, an anti-capitalist government monopoly put in place to prevent competition and lower prices. And even at that, he had to put his thumb on the scale. First of all, that $18 is for the highest dose. The lowest dose is $4.99. Also, he didn't bother to tell you that the patented version, known as diflucan, is a single dose. That one pill is all you need, except on rare occasions where you might need a second a week or two later. Whereas Alphacon, the generic he shows, is taken 3 times a week for up to 8 weeks. That's why he had to do it per pill, so you wouldn't know his 60 cents a pill can add up to that exact same $18.
But I already hear someone saying, if they didn't patent it and charge a premium, regardless of the ethics, it would deter research in the future.
That person would not be a capitalist. We're against patents, Hakeem. We're against all forms of IP.
If these major pharmaceutical companies didn't receive massive tax breaks and government funding for much of what they develop.
Are you freaking serious? I thought you were supposed to be criticizing capitalism here. So yeah, one more socialist Nimrod who can't refute capitalism itself, so he has to lie and pretend that government action is capitalism. Pathetic.
Back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Guardio.
Oh, for the absolute love of...
Big thanks to Guardio for the sponsorship. This is what allows me to pay my editor.
What? You're exploiting his labor? Your logic, Hakeem. If you're not paying him 100% of what you take in, you're stealing his surplus labor. And you do not get to say that you deserve any money because you put in work too, until you acknowledge everything that business owners put into their firms as well, which is a lot.
If something truly was made by capitalism, then surely it must have been funded by capitalists and been from the private sector, right? Surprisingly, the majority, I dare say even all of the things we've become so close with, came out of government-funded public sector projects, not the private sector.
But you've just been complaining about government funding and government protectionism. Do you have any consistency here? Or was that the idea of sticking in the sponsored segment at this point, to give people a chance to forget that?
In fact, innovation has happened not due to capitalism necessarily, and in many instances has happened in spite of it.
Then explain the graph I showed earlier.
Short of the early history of capitalism, in which relentless expansion of the productive forces and their efficiency, including the overworking of men, women, and children, forced a cynical development of technology.
He doesn't say when he thinks the early history of capitalism is, but this picture is from 1908. By that point, Far fewer children were working than had been at the real start of capitalism 100 years earlier. In fact, most children below 14 who were working at this point were orphans who had no other means of support. And before you say anything, look at socialist countries to see how horrible orphans do, if they survive at all. As I've pointed out before, children were always working, and much harder than before capitalism was instituted. While capitalism made it so that, for the first time in history, children didn't have to work, the forces of statism were working against it. Thomas Jefferson was the champion of capitalism. His intellectual opposition was Alexander Hamilton, who championed the very mercantilism they just fought a war to get rid of. Here's something Hamilton said that you'll never hear from fans of the musical. This is the employment of persons who would otherwise be idle, children more early useful by manufacturing establishments than they would otherwise be. Of the number of persons employed in the cotton manufactories of Great Britain, it is computed that 4 out of 7 nearly are women and children, of whom the greatest proportion are children, and many of them of a very tender age. If you don't want children to have to work, you want capitalism, not mercantilism or socialism. Oh, and by the way, did you notice how he basically just said he was against technology? So basically, he wants 2/3 of the world to starve. Which, admittedly, socialism would get done for him. And then he follows that up with the lie that socialism invented nuclear power, satellites, LEDs, and all sorts of things. I don't think you need me to debunk all of that. One thing socialism did innovate, though, the nuclear disaster.
Imagine a world where education is treated like the human right it intrinsically is.
See, he keeps coming back to this, and I just don't get it. How does he not know that education is not only provided by government, by monopoly force, but also makes it illegal not to be educated? I mean, where is this horrible free market in education he's complaining about? Ironically, so-called socialist countries like Sweden, which, yeah, we know Scandinavia isn't really socialist, as well as other countries like Belgium and Finland, have an educational system that's far closer to a free market than ours. It's still government education, but they have a money follows the child policy where parents have a choice of which school to send their kid to, forcing them to compete. They've had it in place for decades, and it's been an immense success. Children educated in this system do far better than children in those countries did before, as well as children in other European countries that don't do that. And yet, if anyone dares to suggest making a baby step in that direction here in America, leftist twits like Hakeem go absolutely ape and freak out about it.
Imagine a world where your community's needs and your personal creativity are what drive innovations and not the need to turn a profit for some middle management asshat.
You do know that middle management doesn't get profits, right? That they're just paid a salary? That the owners of the company are the ones that make a profit? If you don't even understand how these things are set up, where do you get off running your fool mouth about it?
Imagine a world where we have true democracy.
Don't have to. We already have. The results were horrible. Democracy is a form of tyranny. Please, no one keep pretending that socialism is a form of anarchy.
Imagine socialism. That conveniently for us has already been tried and tested.
And failed! Hundreds of millions dead! Not counting wars and other horrible things government did.
I'm sure you've heard of automation. Far from being a vision of some sci-fi future, it's actually a meaningful possibility within our lifetimes. The hurdle, though, as is commonplace nowadays, is capitalism.
Okay, so he's not only saying automation is a good thing, but that capitalism gets in the way of it. Hey, Hakeem, get on board with the socialist talking points. You're peeing on Richard Wolff's parade.
A capitalist will automate a factory, and through doing this he will see productivity rise and his long-term costs go down, as he will fire the workers now made redundant due to the introduction of these new machines.
Of course, we know that isn't what happens, as evidenced by the fact that we didn't all starve when the farms were automated. But let's follow his demented little timeline.
These workers that have now become a liability for the capitalist are let go, as the capitalist has no need to pay wages. This eventually spells a problem for capitalism that the capitalists don't foresee.
I know I'm doing a lot of editing here, but that's because this guy can ramble.
Won't actually be able to sell their products. All these out-of-job workers won't have the money to buy any of these products that capitalists are churning out, and voila, one of the many contradictions of capitalism unfolds.
You'd think that, taking all this time to make a video, he'd also have time to actually look at history. Oh, wait. He said he'd pay someone else to make the video. Well, I guess you get what you pay for. Nice editing, horrible thinking processes. Anyway, in 1800, over 90% of us were farmers. Over the next 150 years, the farms were mechanized, and then 90% of us weren't farmers. And yet, we still had money to pay for the things produced. Why? Because we were producing other things. Things that hadn't even existed in 1800. And even farm workers have it a lot easier. Instead of spending all day harvesting something by hand, you just sit in a tractor and pull levers. He's making out like automation means these workers are just out of luck. Of course, what really happens is that labor resources are freed up and can be used for other things. Just like buggy whip makers didn't starve when cars came out, these workers won't starve as automation is put in place. In fact, they'll be better off because they'll be living in an economy where goods can be produced more efficiently. So they'll have jobs that are more efficient and their paychecks will go further as a result. I don't understand how anyone looking at the history of the United States can come to any other conclusion.
That's not even mentioning the misanthropic sense of the system, which would sooner keep you working 8, 10, or 12 hours, increasing your working day if they can get away with it.
Again, people make this complaint in addition to complaining that companies are cutting hours and not hiring full-time workers. Again, can we have the slightest bit of consistency here, please?
Just as the real wage versus productivity curve since the 70s, by the way.
I've talked about this before. The short answer is almost 200 years of capitalism and wages and productivity, by his own admission, grow with each other. Then, Johnson implements his socialist Great Society, and Nixon closes the gold window, and the combination of government spending and inflation is what causes this to diverge. I really don't get how these morons don't realize how self-defeating it is to point this out. By the way, did you notice? If you think about how the gears in his graphic would move, they'd all gum up the works and stop entirely. I find that kind of ironic.
But what if there was an alternative? Rather than having machines put large swaths of the population out of work due to the anarchy of capitalism in the market, under socialism these machines would be used as intended, to reduce the amount of work we all need to do without dropping people from the workforce.
And how are you going to account for the changing demand that would result from this? You'd be producing too much of whatever that product is, meaning that prices would crash, tons of items would be left on the shelf unpurchased, and these same workers would end up not having means of making money anyway. The layoffs happen to prevent this. The workers are no longer needed to produce enough of the item to meet demand, so they can go and produce something else. Maybe something entirely new. How is your wonderful socialist collective supposed to know what that is? Once the crash comes and they're all faced with starvation, how are you supposed to know what the new thing is they're supposed to be making? And, going back to the question I asked at the beginning, where is the capital to make that new thing going to come from? How does the factory get built? Who makes the parts? Who builds the factory to make the parts? Da capo al I pencil.
Rather than working 8, 10, 12-hour days, people can work 2, 3, or 4-hour days.
Oh, we could probably do that now if we wanted to live the way we did in the 1950s. No refrigerators, no central AC, no electronics other than lights and a couple of appliances. Having to have milk and ice delivered every morning because nothing will keep overnight. Measles and polio running rampant because the vaccines aren't available yet, and so on. Since no socialist understands economics, they don't understand the foundational principles of economics. Resources are limited, but desires are unlimited. We're not working less because we want more. Computers and phones and high-speed internet, cheap drinks in plastic bottles, food we can cook in less than 2 hours, more than 3 channels of TV to watch, the ability to buy any product we want no matter how remote an area we live in, clocks that set themselves, communicating instantly with anyone in the world, audio and video, for basically free, unprecedented amounts of leisure time, and more things we can do with that time. Longer lives, healthier lives, I can keep going! Again, he says nothing about how his precious socialism can even begin to do any of that. And certainly not how we can get all of that without working. Just platitudes about serving humanity and bloviating about how bad profit is. So thanks for watching. Please hit like and subscribe, leave a comment, and go to donate.bogosity.tv to keep me doing what I do. And check out all the great content here, like this video selected just for you.